It was wonderful to see my guest, William Keyte, who was on the show with me talking about the Constitution on Neil Oliver's show on GB News last night. I'll put a link in the description. It was wonderful to see Neil Oliver just talking about this so eloquently, so poetically, such a great man. And between the two of them, understanding this business with the Constitution and how the power is very much in our hands. And I'm pleased to say that William will be coming back to answer more questions about that very soon on the channel. And at some point it would be lovely to have Neil himself and I talking about these things and where we are. But there is a cost to all of this. I've noticed as I've been talking and asking questions, there does seem to be quite a big cost to oneself. And I'm sure you've shared the same experience. Cost of friendships, cost of being laughed at, cost of people turning their backs on you. We saw it during Brexit, of course, where some people who had an opposing view of the mainstream view were deemed to be idiots and stupid. But during the pandemic was really a time when many people who were questioning what the government meant by the science, why we were following one policy and not another, why everything seemed skewed one way, and why common sense seemed to be thrown out of the window. We saw that in the fact that everybody had to be locked down, not the vulnerable, that the immune system wasn't to be relied on. Things that we know now about vitamin D and zinc and things like that, and other products that could have helped people, that people were turned away from hospitals and GPs in the early stages because it was deemed that it was better for you to go home and suffer, and basically at the point where you can barely breathe, that's the time to go to hospital. And yet any medical problem that you have, if you saw a lump and you needed to have it checked out, the sooner intervention happened, the better the outcome. So people were questioning, of course, but people were finding, as I found, people were upset with you. Friendships were broken. It was a big cost. I had a walking pal that I used to go walking with and make videos. But because I was questioning and suggesting that things weren't quite right, he turned his back on me and walked away. But I ask you, what cost if we don't ask these questions? What is the bigger price that we have to pay? For the government seems to be becoming more authoritarian, bringing us these digital IDs, the 15-minute cities, claiming that we've got to get to net zero, which recently I was watching a Cambridge professor working out the exact cost of going to net zero by 2050, and his estimate was that by the time you've trained sufficient people to put the infrastructure in, you've paid for all the resources that we would need and the materials, it was actually, excuse me, going to be about £2 trillion. And it was never going to happen. I'll talk more about that in another video. What cost if we allow our liberties, our freedom, which is a better word, to be restricted and to be monitored, to be put into this zero trust world? What cost is it? And I would say it's a far, far bigger cost than standing up and saying, no, we don't want this. I've been reading a book, Superabundance, which I mentioned in a video fairly recently, and they were looking at the one-child policy in China, I think from the 1980s to 2015, a policy in which China's growing population, there was a worry that there was going to be too many people and the resources would be used up. This is an old argument, of course. And as a result of this, people were going to be poorer and people would suffer. And so the one-child policy came in. Now, we know China is a communist state, a dictatorship, and their tyrannical approach. But what seemed to be a laudable idea, that they wanted to restrict it to perhaps one child, which on the face of it may seem like a sensible policy, perhaps. Of course it isn't, but it may in some lights be dressed up that way. Well, in order to enact this policy, you're interfering with biology and human tendencies. So people were having one child and they were still having sex, and they were having second children, and women were being taken, rounded up, they were being taken and strapped to beds. And if they was pregnant with a second child, I was reading about one particular case, not uncommon, in which some injection to stimulate labour was created, and a baby towards mid or late term, say 7 or 8 months, not yet ready, but was born, still living, taken from the mother and drowned in a bucket of water. So many atrocities as a result. 400 million potential children had been murdered in this brutal regime. In India, a similar thing had taken place, where they were worried also about overpopulation, and the measures that they took, equally horrendous, of sterilizing people, rounding them up randomly, and many people were sterilized more than once. People just taken away and murdered. On the face of it, as I say, dressed up to be a laudable thing, trying to protect. And yet it's very easy for these governments to sort of think that the policy is right, but the carrying out of these policies is not right. My worry is that as we head towards a more communist dictatorship style government, which seems incredible that these measures could happen. We've already seen the beginning of this during the pandemic. No jab, no job. We've seen the mandating of passports, of vaccine passports. We've seen the hint of these things. The idea that you are now guilty and you have to prove who you are in order to achieve or get certain services. That a central bank of digital currency, will not only let you have your money if your carbon credits are right. This is totally wrong and not a government. See, I grew up in the 60s and 70s, as I've mentioned before, where we had relative freedom. It seemed freedom. It seemed a much kinder and more benevolent society. I'm sure the government, in its own thinking, feels that it's doing the right thing, feels that they're benevolent and trying to do the right thing. And you know, maybe they are, but the policies are completely wrong and not suitable. And it takes people like Neil Oliver, like myself in my very small limited way, to question this. For this is not freedom for the people. And we do have a constitution, and we must take advantage of it. So I'm very pleased that William will be back on the show to talk more about this and offer practical ways in which we can grasp that all this theatre, this legislation, these rules, these statutes is not lawful. It's not real law, and that the common law of the land will and must be invoked.